Welcome. Today's episode of the Method Made podcast. I'm joined with David Bruehlmann, CMC Strategy Expert. And in today's exciting conversation, we're going to be talking about the strategic cost of missing operational details in tech transfer in the context of CMC. So David, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nico.
David, I've noticed on your profile that you work on eliminating the expensive mistake and delays. And I'd love to sort of understand at a high level, what do you see as the root causes of these kinds of strategic failures at a very high level?
Yeah, let me tell you about the moment I learned this expensive lesson of my career, because one day our boss walked in our office and said to our team, "Hey, you'll have the pleasure of doing a quick and straightforward tech transfer. It's going to be a piece of cake."
Yeah.
We were excited.
I've heard this story a lot.
Yes, we were excited. This sounds great. And then he told us, we have already made clinical batches years ago. It's the same process, the same team. What could possibly go wrong? Right? Well, everything went wrong. Everything. So
now for some context, was this tech transfer close by? Was it like overseas? Or how many people were involved? Was it like a big? Was it a big?
That was in a big pharma company. It was an established market in Europe. So no, it's not overseas. So and team wise, that's a really good question. I mean, I don't know exactly how many. I mean, if we count production and tech transfer team and CMC, probably about 20 people ish, something like that. I would say. Probably a few more if you add the regulatory folks, and then. Yeah, it was, long story short, everything went wrong, and we were basically doing process development in the large scale, which is not a good spot to be at. So this story illustrates of what can go wrong. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. And what I recently also noticed is this is not an isolated case, because I've read, depending on the statistics, you will see numbers of over 40% of R&D failings fail because of CMC problems. There's probably some disagreement about these numbers, but I think the ballpark figure is probably right. And so, yeah, the question is, why does this happen? What I learned that day, and this is something I'm now preaching to all startup founders, CMC cannot be an afterthought. It must be the priority from day one. So for those founders who are listening, even if you're in discovery right now and you haven't even thought about process development, you should already start thinking about CMC right now. So you have to treat it as a strategic asset, not just as an afterthought or something you will do later, or, scale up is not just scaling up no, it's very complicated, and you have to prepare for it.
Okay, well, two directions I want to go there, and you can sort of pick. So one of them is sort of, let's say our audience here are early stage. Many of them are from a technical background and may have limited experience working in pharma so far. So like, even at a high level, what even is a CMC strategy? Like, what does that even mean to start with, to sort of contextualize the conversation? And the other thing is about process development, but let's start with that.
Yes, that's a really good question. I love it, because CMC should not be an afterthought. So what is CMC? In the pharmaceutical, like biotech or even cell and gene therapy, it comes down to developing a process and scaling it up and finally get market approval so you can serve your patients. And so what does it include? And I'm a big fan of quality by design. You need to start with the end in mind, meaning that, okay, what does our patient actually need? What is the formulation? Will that be an oral drug? Is it an IV drug, or whatever that might be? And then once this is clear, you work the way backwards, and then you define what you call a control strategy, which is the analytical part to make sure that you're actually producing that drug. And once this is defined, what are the critical quality attributes? Then you need to look at your process and define what you call a critical process parameter. You do a critical process parameter assessment to look at what are these process parameters. Let's take a MAP process, for instance, pH of your culture. What is the impact if of the pH if it's already if it's, let's say, 0.5 higher? What does this mean? Is there an impact on the productivity? Will the glycosylation profile of my map change? These are questions you need to answer. And then once this is clear, you need to tightly monitor your process. And then I think that leads to your second question about what is process development, right?
Yeah, well, so one thing that just came to mind during that explanation is the way you're sort of describing these things is it sounds like it is the engineering approach to this entire process, is defining the constraints ahead of time that you need to meet in order for your product to actually end up where you want it to be, which is, I really like that definition, that is starting from the end in mind and then saying, okay, if this is where I want to go at the discovery level, what do I have to do today to end up on the route to get there, as opposed to trying to navigate day by day. It's like the long-term map to get you to market.
Exactly, because it's your North Star. Finally, the patient is your North Star, and you work everything back from there. Instead of, as you said, you just figure it out day by day. That's not a good strategy.
Yeah. So what I was wondering about with the process development is, sometimes I hear this process development happening at the discovery site, at the IP owners at their lab. Often there's process development happening at CDMOs. From a sort of CMC perspective, where should it be happening at both of these places? Like, how should that handoff happen? I hear sometimes this can be like a place of friction where, like during tech transfer especially, what do you see as like the reality of what happens and an ideal sort of direction for companies to go?
The short answer is it depends. Let me explain what that means. It very much depends on the size of your company. It depends on your experience. Have you people who have CMC experience or even large-scale manufacturing experience? And then also it comes down to a strategic question. Do you have the infrastructure or even the budget, the funding to produce in-house? So with all that, they're different. I mean, they're really different options and different strategies. But let me give you a few examples. For instance, you are a small company with little CMC experience. Probably in that scenario, especially if you're just starting, let's say phase one, you're gonna go for an IND filing. It likely makes a lot of sense to rely heavily on a CDMO because you probably don't have the funding to build a facility, to train all your staff, and it will take way too long. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you're more experienced and you have people who have process development background or manufacturing background, and you want to go for phase 2, phase 3, even you have a longer runway, it likely makes sense to do the process development in-house, because the advantage is that you get the process knowledge, process understanding, and this is a very important asset. So always it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off of how fast you want to move versus how much knowledge you want to keep or develop in-house, and how much money you are willing to spend to develop a process development lab, or even a pilot scale, or even a facility for clinical manufacturing. But I would say where most people rely on CDMOs definitely is once you produce larger clinical batches, or even then if you don't have the capacity for the manufacturing scale.
Okay, and so something I'd like to get into also is the sort of level of characterization and documentation that might be available during tech transfers in these different situations you described. So maybe with like a larger company you mentioned, they might do some in-house process development, and the process is probably more developed by the time that they hand it off. And I'm assuming that with these smaller companies, it's more like lab notes, like at the R&D scale. Do you see differences in what the CDMO is going to receive in terms of like how, like a lot of like missing details, depending on whether they've decided to sort of outsource the more of the development versus doing some of that in house?
Yeah, sure. There is a difference. I would say in particular if the CMC knowledge is limited in house, probably the documentation is much more limited, or as you said, maybe perhaps even resembles more to lab notes. On the other hand, I would say, but this is not per se a problem. It will depend on what kind of CDMO you choose. And if you have a trusted partner who can help you navigate that, you will be fine. I would say it's not a problem to not have the expertise in house. It's also a strategic question. Maybe you don't even want to have the expertise in house for whatever strategic reason. That's fine. It's fine as long as you are aware of the pitfalls and aware of the complexity. But if you don't have the knowledge to come up with, let's say, decent SOPs or so on, it's extremely important to, number one, find the right CDMO who is a trusted partner who will help you navigate that. And they will not just put you on kind of a platform, you will sell something which looks amazing, but at the end of the day, locks you into perhaps a production system that's not optimal. And number two, I would also highly encourage you to work with advisors, consultants that have a critical eye on that have walked the path before. Then you will be fine, because this can be a very good path. And I know also there are some virtual companies, they don't even have any even process development in-house, then that works fine.
Yeah. So this is something that's come up in a few conversations, is sort of matching with the right CDMO. And I'm curious from your perspective, like what does that mean? Does that mean finding a CDMO who's manufactured your type of product a lot? How would you like how should companies navigate that kind of question?
There are several factors to consider. I think number one is the size of the CDMO, and number two is the experience. I think these are probably where you should start. Let's take the big ones: Lonza, Samsung, Biologics, and so on. And then there's a lot of smaller companies. Now, if you're a small company, you're probably better off working with a smaller CDMO. Here's the reason why that is the case. Because if you go to a Lonza or a Samsung, you're probably going to end up being number 545 on the list, because it's just a small volume. They have much bigger projects, and probably it's a tendency. It could make sense, but I would say the tendency is that the service you're getting doesn't fit what you need, because you will not have that time and energy from the CDMO that you will need as a small company. And the other thing is also very likely a smaller CDMO will be more flexible in the approach. And this can be of interest, especially if you have a novel host or you have perhaps a different molecule. This can also be of interest to work with a smaller CDMO that treats you as a valuable client, and you get world-class service. On the other hand, if you have large volumes, it's a standard molecule, and you're ramping up for phase 2 or phase 3, a larger CDMO can definitely make sense in that case. And then the other thing I said, experience is very important. You need a CDMO that knows what they're doing. Then you have other things like cost. Perhaps if you're developing a biosimilar, you're more cost sensitive. So you could look into different geographies like India or other emerging markets that deliver high class service at the fraction of the cost. And then the last thing I would say, it's culture as well, because working with a CDMO is almost like getting married. So, or having a partner. I mean, you don't get along with everyone, and that's fine. So you need to have this conversation up front, and also think about, do we get along? Do we speak the same language? Does this make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, this is something that's come up a lot, is just the cultural interpersonal relation, because it's a long-term, it's not a short-term relationship. So yeah, it's clear that this is very important. Now, something I'd like to get into a bit, you mentioned novel hosts, and I'd love to discuss a bit about these novel technologies, like whether it's a new host or a very innovative scientific technology you're using. Let's talk a bit about the differences about using a large-scale CDMO that might have very established processes. It sounds like a smaller CDMO might be better suited when you might need flexibility, say if you're using a new host. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. I would say yes, I agree with you. I would think that small and mid-sized CDMO they are for sure more flexible. Where it's not 100% clear, do they have the expertise to deal with a novel host? And I think that's an area where the size doesn't necessarily have an influence. It's more about what kind of molecules have they worked on and what kind of employees they have, what is the expertise. So if you have a novel host, you need to do this due diligence to understand, are they actually capable of, for instance, using a completely different bioreactor system, and how much will it cost, and how much time will they need to train staff or to change a part of their facility and so on. I'm not sure if larger CDMOs would do it because they specialize in much higher volumes. And they probably would say, no, that's not what we do. We prefer working with in stainless steel tanks or so on. Or some of the big ones might also have different facilities, so they could offer all kinds of different services.
Okay, and so something that I've heard can be a challenge with sort of CDMO selection and engaging with CDMOs is ensuring that the facilities are in place, the expertise and so on is actually there for your specific process. Do you think there's like room for sort of an improvement in the way that people sort of select the CDMOs, and how these relationships sort of form to ensure that everything is in place? What I'm wondering is there a way to sort of de-risk this relationship at the beginning so that you don't end up 6 months down the line figuring out that for operational reasons, equipment reasons, that you can't do what you initially wanted to?
Yes. Well, you need to do a thorough due diligence when you are engaging with CDMOs to understand, do they have the expertise? If you can, go visit the CDMO, see how the facility looks like, talk about the regulatory side, all the approvals they have, and what projects they have worked on. Look at and if you can also, if you know certain companies who have worked with these CDMOs, just to get an unbiased feedback. What was the experience? I would definitely do that. And then another thing, which is extremely important to de-risk that, is to look into the tech transfer. And there's some CDMOs, they do that very well. They have an amazing track record, because tech transfer is a challenge, and you need to look at all the details, and details matter when you're doing a tech transfer.
I'd love to discuss a bit about that. Like, what do you see? I know that consultants are usually involved in tech transfer. what are sort of best practices for like how do the smooth at a high level, how do smooth tech transfers go that horrible ones don't go?
Yes. Well, let me tell about the horrible first. We had this project many years ago. We were transferring a process from one lab to another lab, the exact same bioreactors, the same type, the same models, the same process, the same SOPs, the same raw materials, everything looked the same. So we did the due diligence, and this is extremely important. So for a good tech transfer, you need to do that. So we did the homework. We looked at all the details, the SOP, how are people trained, what are the raw materials, what are the bioreactors. So this is very important to succeed in a tech transfer. But the tech transfer did not succeed. We had different cell culture performance at site A and site B. And it took us a long time to investigate and finally find the root cause. And again, this confirms that details matter. The cause finally was a different light exposure between the labs. I mean, wow. That's how far it goes. Crazy.
That is, wow. That is such a minute and fine detail. Yeah.
Yes. So I want to say, in order to succeed your tech transfer, you need to look at every nitty-gritty detail. It's very important. And now the challenge comes into, for instance, if you transfer to a CDMO, you will have things that are not the same because the bioreactor will be different. And perhaps they source different raw materials. Perhaps they do certain part of the cell culture slightly differently. So you need to assess all these risks and understand, is this a high risk? Is this a low risk? And then you have to do the tech transfer. And perhaps you will see, oh yeah, this is a big risk and you need to redo certain things.
Okay, so something I'd love to sort of I'm just thinking about that situation with the lights. So one question I have is, do you see the sort of root cause of many of these problems that developers, the people who are building these procedures, they're working in a place, a lab, they've walked into it, they've been trained, but like, I'm imagining if I'm trained in a lab, no one's telling me how the lights work because that's just,
Exactly.
no one thinks about that. So I guess it sounds like, especially in that story, that the sort of root cause of that is there are always things that impact your process, and it's difficult to know all of what those are because you're focused on like what's right in front of you. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Is that where that's coming from?
It comes down to a thorough process understanding. So that's why I also said at the beginning, it could be a good idea, or I think in general, it's a good idea to acquire some process understanding to avoid certain of these mistakes. You probably cannot avoid all the mistakes because you can only put so much into an SOP.
Yeah.
And in the most cases, you're fine because the process is not that sensitive, and you would even see a difference. But sometimes it's very sensitive, and you will run into problems. But what is important is to have this mindset and to think also. When you're transferring, what does the receiving party actually understand? If I write, do this and then do that in SOP, it might be something completely different for someone in another company, even if they speak the same language. But it's even more difficult if you transfer to a country where they speak another language.
Yeah. So this is something, I'm very interested in, and I don't know. How do you see this working well and not working well? I've heard a lot of the time for tech transfers, you'll kind of line up the corresponding people from each facility. So you have like the quality team talking to the quality, CDMO and discovery, scientists, process development, and so forth. Is there anything you see that can currently be done about these problems of just understand, like when you write an SOP, understanding and confirming the understanding that the other person has actually understood? Because my understanding is a lot of these problems there's just missing details or a lack of alignment. Someone wrote something down, this is the way they understood it to be, and it was just not interpreted the same way on the receiving side?
It comes down to fostering a culture of communication, because I've seen a lot of problems, not only in tech transfers, but even in molecule development projects. If and in several companies, for instance, the R&D side is on a different place, and then you transfer the once it's ready, you transfer it into process development, which is at a different location or a different country. If this is siloed, the problems will start because people don't understand each other, and also people don't even have the reflex maybe to just to call that person because they don't know them. So what I've seen works very well when you start a tech transfer. You do a face-to-face meeting, bringing together all the people working together, and then have regular meetings with these people, because it's essential to know who is this QC guy on the other end, or who is this process development guy, and then have regular meetings. And if something is not clear, jump on a call and discuss it, or go through the SOP and say, okay, this is what not just read it and your recipe and send it to the other guy and then they will implement it. Say, okay, we go through the SOP on a call and ask questions. So we think we do this. What do you understand? And then you will very quickly see if there are some discrepancies between the two sides.
Well, yeah. So this sort of reminds me of some experience just working in labs that I've noticed, especially with scientists, that is replicating procedures. It is not a trivial task, and I've always found that I'm able to reproduce things when I can look over the shoulder and actually see, like, how did they do it? I don't know. I find that it's a world apart. Reading someone's step one, do this, step two, do this, versus actually watching them. I don't know. It's a very different experience.
Yes. Oh yeah. 100%. And that's even the better thing, and we've done it in certain tech transfers, having the team come to our site and look over the shoulder to understand how are you doing that. I would definitely advise that. With the CDMO, I'm not sure how easy that would be. That's probably where it's a bit more complicated. Or also if, for instance, you're a very early stage, I think that's perhaps where the risk lies, to have a bit more gaps. But definitely within a company, for instance, if you're tech transferring from one side to another, yes, the receiving side should absolutely go to the sending side and look over the shoulder of these folks.
Yeah. So something I'd like to, as we're getting closer to the end, discuss also is the sort of risks of these documentation missing details, depending on sort of the level of development of the technology. So, we can look at older technologies like, say, biologics or antibodies, and in comparison to newer ones like cell and gene therapy. Do you see a trend that maybe newer technologies might, just due to their novel nature, be at more of a risk of these kinds of missing details because they're less understood?
I see several things. In the biologic space, we have a lot of platform technologies, and we have spent 30 plus, almost 40 years now perfecting these platforms, these ways of culturing cells. So, and also I'd say in the biologic space, people have a much stronger CMC mindset, scale up and so on, and many companies have done it. What I see on the new modality side, especially cell and gene therapy, well, obviously it's novel. It's still much more research based, research and development based. So I would say it's probably MAPS 40 years ago, like the same mentality. We're still figuring out a lot of things. A lot of things are not clear. And then there is the other thing that's a huge challenge in the cell and gene therapy space. We have now all of a sudden patient populations of one. So the batch sizes are much smaller, and every every development is different, uses different equipment, has different steps, and we cannot, in certain cases, even do traditional process validation. So cell and gene therapy is much more complex than a biologics process. And in biologic, we say the process is the product. But in the cell and gene therapy, it's even more complex because, for instance, if you take a cell therapy, actually your cell is your product. It's not just the protein that is expressed, it's your cell that's infinitely bigger, larger, and much more complex than an antibody, for instance. So the risk is definitely much higher and the complexity is much higher in the advanced therapies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I've seen a lot of people sort of mentioning this difference about like the process of the product in some circumstances, not so much in cell and gene. I'd love to better understand what is it like, what is different about these different technologies, that some of them you're selling the process and in others it is the actual cell.
Yeah, so in the biologic space, you work with recombinant cells that express a certain protein of interest. So at the end of the day, what you're interested in is your antibody, for instance, or your fusion molecule or multispecific. So yes, the cells are important because you want to cultivate the cells in the right conditions in order to have the right product quality. But you're not using the cells. The cells are discarded, and that's it.
Okay.
However, in the cell therapy, let's take a stem cell therapy. You're cultivating cells that can differentiate in all kinds of different cell types, depending on your pH, depending on your raw materials, depending on how, on your shear stress. So it's extremely important to know what you're doing and how you control your process to make sure that your stem cells, for instance, are viable and they're still doing the right thing they're meant for. So you're using the cell. You cannot just kill the cell. You have to work with the cells you have in your bioreactor. So it's a completely different way of looking at your product.
So would you say there's sort of more complexity involved in these new technologies like cell therapy in the process compared to, the antibodies?
Well, it depends what you understand or what you see as complexity. If you look at the cell, yes, it's definitely more complex, and the way you culture it. If we look at complexity from a side of what kind of automation are we using, or what kind of process analytical technologies we're using, there we see a lot more complexity in the biologic space. But I would not say it's a complexity per se. Yes, it's complex process. We see digital twins, we see online control and so on. It looks complex from I'd say the processing side, but it simplifies the way we culture finally our product, and also it lowers the risk. But at the moment still, we don't see that much process analytics on the cell and gene therapy side yet. It's much less evolved or developed than on the biologic side.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, it makes me think about the sort of different levels of sort of where these technologies are at. Cell and gene, it sounds like it's much more cutting edge, and there's just certain consequences of that. And, something that makes me sort of wonder as well, we were talking about the culture before of, people interacting in these places. And would you say do you see sort of cultural differences between science and the engineering mindset of process development? Like when I look in graduate school, I see a lot of the rewards and the emphasis seems to be on results. It's like, I want to see this graph. I want to see these cells doing a certain thing. And yeah, of course, to get to those results, you have to have, a process to do that. Do you see any kind of like clash there in mindset between the sort of engineering mindset that might be more oriented towards ensuring everything is documented during the process development versus, say, a new scientist who's joined a company who might just have finished a PhD, who's been trained to focus on getting the results to see the graph that they expect?
There are different mindsets. A scientist likely comes from a discovery side of things. A scientist is usually more interested in the molecule, in the biotherapeutic itself, or perhaps on the analytical side, developing a new mass spec technology. And so, yeah, there's definitely a different mindset than a process. On the other hand, a process engineer looks at, okay, how can we make things simple? How can we produce that drug reliably in a robust way? And also sustainably, at the end of the day, once you're producing at 15, in a 15,000 liter facility, you need to look at your costs. So an engineer looks much more about efficiencies, about simplicity, about making things robust, whereas a scientist is, well, I would say tendency is that these people look more at or work more out of a scientific curiosity and generate results, and probably the end result is not that important. Yeah. But that's very stereotypically. I mean, there are all kinds of nuances, obviously, in between.
Yeah. Well, the reason I'm wondering is we were talking about tech transfer, and I wonder also if sometimes this can be part of it. If the initial discovery is made by a scientist and then it's handed off to an engineer, and they're, of course, communication is important, but also if they're just thinking about it in a different way.
Yeah, definitely. And I see another thing is I talk to a lot of biotech startup founders who have an R&D background, or they come from a medical background, or sometimes even from an investor background, which, it's very far from science. And what I notice that these people don't think about CMC development, so not even process development or manufacturing that much. They think, yeah, we can do this later. It's basically just manufacturing, and we will do that, when we have time. And no, this is not a good mentality, because it is very complex. And I observe that scientific founders sometimes underestimate the complexity and the risk in the process development and scale up.
And who does, as we're coming to the end, who do you find does think about CMC? Like, does anyone really think about it if they're sort of new, or is it do you see it very often that it's sort of an afterthought that is, puts people in a bad place far down the road?
Well, I hope that they think more and more about CMC, and that's what I'm trying to do to raise awareness, because it's so important. But also, if you look at the statistics, they tell us a different story. And also what I hear talking to a lot of different other consultants or people in CMC, unfortunately, there's still a lot of founders out there who don't have the time, or they wait too long and think we can pull this off because this is just a map and we will do it. Yes, developing a map is much more simple because you can use a template, you use Joe, and that's it. But if you're developing a new modality, a cell and gene therapy, you need also to start thinking about CMC already today, because in the advanced therapy, R&D and CMC are not separate. They're actually more blended into each other. So you should start even earlier in the ATM the advanced therapy space.
That makes a lot of sense. And sort of one last thing I'm sort of wondering about, in terms of CMC, do you see a lot of differences between, say, first-time founders who might come from a scientific background? Do people who have done this before, people who have at least worked extensively in biotech, do you see them paying more attention to and setting up these sort of CMC strategies at the beginning compared to, say, people who might come from, from a PhD background, or you mentioned like investors?
Those who have done it before, or those founders who have worked in larger companies, in larger companies, the CMC teams, they know what they're doing, and they have done so many projects. they know it's important, they know how to do it. And if they don't have the expertise, for instance, if somebody's perhaps more from discovery but has worked in a larger company, they know how who to rely on. They pull in other experts by hiring or external advisors. So definitely they have this awareness, and they know also how to go about it.
Okay. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, David. Thanks for joining on today's episode, and yeah, thanks a lot.
Sure, it's a huge pleasure. Thank you for having me, Nico.
Great.